coronavirus, which has brought life to a shuddering halt, poses one of the greatest threats to the survival of legacy media. With the diminishing influence of traditional platforms like newspapers, radio and television at the expense of the digital ecosystem peppered by clickbait journalism, the resilience of legacy media will further be pushed to the limits by the pandemic. The Executive Director of African Center for Media Excellence, Peter Mwesige, told NTV that the fundamental responsibility of a journalist in this period would be to provide the public with accurate, reliable information.
Accurate, reliable information to the public about this pandemic in all its facets, different dimensions. Secondly, to provide a platform for debate about how we are dealing with it. And thirdly, to hold those who are in power accountable for the decisions they are making or not making.
It's a view echoed by the public editor of Nation Media Group Uganda, Charles Odobo Bichachi, who says that traditional media remains the most critical voice during such an unprecedented period.
The media becomes a very, very critical element because then information can only come best through the media. So people are glued to their television stations, people are glued to the radios, people are picking newspapers, and of course people are on social media, which is not a regulated media, but media all the same. So I think the media during a time like this becomes very much part of the life. It becomes part of the story, it becomes part of the solution, and also part of the problem if we don't do certain things the way we should best do them as a media.
But can legacy media, whose influence continues to wane, be relied upon for boldness, objectivity and accuracy during the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, they have tried, especially if reporting accurately is looked at in the narrow sense of repeating what they have been told by officialdom. I mean, I think that they have, at no time have I seen as much, attempt by the media to give the government, such space and airtime to tell their stories.
In our assessment of what the media has been and has not been able to do, we need to be cognizant of that strained environment. We are seeing newsrooms downsizing, we are seeing newsrooms cutting back on salaries of staff. So that in itself is a situation that puts media houses in a very, if I may say, compromised position in a way. Yet again, the public, on the other hand, is expecting them to deliver on the job as much as possible.
In the digital age and post-truth politics epoch, social media platforms churn out information with a brazen disregard of facts, forming an information cascade unlike the traditional media, which relies on conventional gatekeeping methods.
Remember that in the newsrooms, we have these processes of the gatekeeper that help with verifying information, so much that even where a falsehood has accidentally sieved through, you trust that the traditional media will come up and at least give a correction and apologize for the error, which is not the case in social media. That is not to say that social media is full of falsehoods, but that at least if the two are put on a pedestal, you still want to rely on traditional media. So they've done pretty well in the pandemic and in the constrained environment that they operate in at the moment.
Because there's so much information, false, misinformation, malinformation all over social media, I think the legacy media has been a primary buffer that people have had to been able to reflect on the different information they get and see if the legacy media has picked it and how they are playing it.
The falsehoods and spin on social media have eroded public trust as everyone has his own set of facts. Mwesige opines that whereas legacy media has extensively covered events during the pandemic, the threshold of accuracy is much higher.
So I think in that sense, yeah, there's been lots of accuracy, obviously. I mean, assuming that what they are telling us in, in government circles is itself accurate. But I think that for me, accuracy goes beyond simply providing a pedestal or platform to officialdom. It also includes us asking them questions. Because sometimes, let's face it, the people who are in charge of this mean very well for Uganda, I assume, definitely. They must mean well for Uganda. But at the end of it all, very many of them are also politicians. They have another agenda too. They have to stay in power.
But as advertising revenues and sales for legacy media continue to plummet, there are fears that newspapers and other forms of traditional media could fold as COVID upends the industry.
The bigger question is, how does the media as a business model today survive? It has been pegged for the newspapers on circulation and advertising. Both are down. If you go to the broadcast media, it has primarily relied on advertising and, of course, audience numbers. That is also under attack. So as a media, we will have to find alternative sources of income.
With mounting industry pressures, traditional media may pander towards attracting high viewership ratings and seek to toe inclinations such as right-wing populism at the expense of the truth. In Uganda's context, there are fears that whereas legacy media has an opportunity to reclaim its position as the most authoritative and accurate platform for news, the COVID pandemic poses an existential threat to platforms such as newspapers. To remain relevant, legacy media must interrogate claims, offer insightful discourse and depth as part of its content. Bichachi cited the classified supplementary vote of about 400 billion shillings recently passed by Parliament to purchase military equipment as an issue which requires scrutiny.
Because COVID is an open disease, it kills people and you will see a dead body. So why do we need to shield certain expenditures around this COVID? Those questions should be asked, and when you ask them consistently, then somebody will be forced to give answers.
Mwesige says that it behoves journalists to simplify a number of things to the public.
Responsibility, the media's responsibility is also to help us understand the architecture that is in charge of our response. Who is doing what? Just those basic things. Who is doing what? So when we look at their failures or their successes, we cannot do that without knowing who are supposed to do what, who actually did what.
We have seen clips of women undressing to ask for food. How much worse must it get? Let us follow them where they are. And then weave the story to tie in all the other issues surrounding the monies, surrounding the government policies, surrounding the efforts by the health workers, and they've done a commendable job.
He argued that there are story ideas that could be more appropriate to report about than the cliche statistics of positive COVID patients.
But there are a lot more people, thousands of Ugandans who are going through worse than, from what I can see, than these 100 who have been infected. There are people who haven't been able to access critical health care, and they have died. Actually, today, I saw some numbers yesterday of people who have died from malaria and some of these other diseases, and I was thinking, it would be good for us to compare those numbers those numbers after the lockdown was announced versus those numbers same period before the lockdown. Also, maybe look at last year, same period, just to sort of get a sense. Are we actually seeing a lot more people dying from some of these diseases than before?
In the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, the public will look up to journalists to offer a platform for insightful debate. Yet whereas the public is expectant of groundbreaking journalism, the future is uncertain for the industry.
Where the newspapers have gotten away with just reporting the ordinary stuff and people buy as a routine, that routine was disrupted by COVID. Now people must have a reason to come back to buy you. And therefore, that means that the legacy media must change the kind of content it's providing. The same applies to television and radios, because the advertisers are going to come after The advertisers have also stopped spending, and when they start spending, they are going to be more discerning. Where are the numbers? If people are not buying you, they are not going to put their money there.
Perhaps is public funding and open society funding what will keep media houses in business?
How else can newsrooms be independent if there's no advertising? What has been done elsewhere that we can borrow and make useful for our Ugandan economy here? What, for instance, like The Guardian is into crowdfunding, is that something we can try back home? Ask people to subscribe to your content at a minimal fee, but the cumulative of which will help you stay afloat in times like these. And whichever other, some other people are pointing to donor funding, although that in itself might come with the donors asking you to toe a certain line. But fundamentally, the question is on the table again on the independence of journalism vis-a-vis the need to survive.
Many countries in Europe have attempted, and some actually have successfully come up with models that fund public interest journalism that is done by private newspapers and broadcasting stations. So in other words, the state doesn't have to support only public media. The state can also support private media that can show that they are putting this money to good use by producing journalism that empowers the public, that informs and engages the ordinary person. The challenge I see is to what end? Give the media money to do what? Do you want to see your money being given to a media that is already subservient to the establishment? Do you want to see your money as a taxpayer given to a media that is not going to tell the story that you want to hear?
Public funding for media needs to start now, and the criteria need to be laid out well. The supplementary budget released 6 billion to support media. But how is it going to support media? And where is it going? And what is the criteria? And as media, we need to start that conversation now and ask these questions so that we are not used as a conduit for 6 billion to simply find its way out of the national coffers.
But without good journalism that holds the powerful to account for their actions, the world can't be a better place to live in.
The death of any kind of public interest media is actually, it should concern all of us. It is the death, in some cases, of democracy.
For instance, as the coronavirus swept across Europe in March, the Hungarian parliament, by a 2/3 majority, granted Viktor Orban the right to rule by decree. The decree specifies that individuals who publicize what are viewed as untrue or distorted facts and which could interfere with the protection of the public or could alarm or agitate a large number of people now face several years in jail. The publication of false news was struck off Uganda's penal code in the 2004 landmark Supreme Court decision where Justice Joseph Mulenga opined that this offense was not compatible with the right of freedom of expression in the Constitution. The Washington Post's slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness," was popularized by its investigative journalist Bob Woodward, whose Watergate expose with his colleague Carl Bernstein led to the resignation of US President Richard Nixon. It's instructive of the times we live in. As traditional media precariously hangs on to keep afloat during the COVID crisis, we ought to be reminded that when government or corporate tyranny manipulate and control the media for their selfish interests, it's the first step towards a collapse of society. Emmanuel Mutaizibwa, NTV.